Hello all, it's Shute here with a quick essential introduction to Baroque ornamentation practice. Now, of course, this topic is one that we can't begin to do justice to in a single video, but at the same time it's not one that we can afford to be without our bearings on, because so much of Baroque music is written with the assumption that performers are going to add tasteful ornamentation to beautify the texture, to the extent that we can't really begin to approach the composer's intentions if we don't do that, which immediately leads us to the conundrum of, well, how do we begin adding notes and ornaments in a way that can be faithful to the style? So in short, that's what I'd like to address in this video. So to start, let's imagine that we have a chorale melody. Now, at least in my experience, if I were to ask a student or someone less familiar with Baroque ornamentation practice to just to ornament it, to add some embellishments, very often I hear things something like this. Which immediately raises several interesting issues. One of them is the use of this ornament. And I know that seems like a silly thing to mention, but I hear it used so much and with so much regularity when people are starting to ornament that I feel it's worth mentioning that ornament as an established thing, for lack of a better term, doesn't really exist in Baroque music. Now, what I'm not saying is that it's implausible that in an impassioned passage that it couldn't be something like that couldn't be added to simulate, say, a voice cracking with emotion. One principle of Baroque ornamentation is that there are certainly norms, but there's also some element of it that's difficult to quantify, that is more effect-oriented than simply a matter of something that could be notated. So I'm not saying that the occurrence of something like that is implausible, but when we think of adding something like that as a regular ornament, to me that becomes a little problematic because it doesn't really sit with what is in use in the period. I suspect that it's coming from our association visually with an ornament that looks like this, which we certainly see in the period, but doesn't mean a single upward turn. It would make sense because, sorry, I'm afraid I'm a little low-tech with this video, but this symbol, which is essentially that with a slash through it, does mean a single downward turn. So it would make sense if the other meant an upward turn. It doesn't work that way. When you see that the squiggle without a slash through it, that's not a mordant, just the squiggle. It means a turn from above. That ornament, right, this ornament as just a single upward turn from the main note has more to do with the late 19th century, like Dvorak violin concerto. Right, that's an instance of that ornament being used in a way that is not a trill, because of course composers at that time, when they indicated a trill, they'd write, T or TR, and the squiggle was used as just a single turn. But in the Baroque period, it's largely synonymous with trill, and there are definitely places where Bach and other composers use them interchangeably. Another issue raised by the embellished passage that I played at first, which was something like, is that all those ornaments consist of slurred alterations of adjacent notes. And we certainly see those sorts of ornaments in the period very commonly. But the question is, does that apply to the entire Baroque period? And if not, when and where is it appropriate? So this chorale melody is actually, as I said, it's an old Lutheran chorale, but so it was set by various composers in various decades. I'm thinking particularly of Pretorius's 1610 setting. So for this period, we're looking at late Renaissance, early Baroque Italianate sort of ornamentation. Pretorius was German, of course, but Germany and Austria were very influenced by Italian practice. And so the ornaments that would be appropriate for this music are quite Italianate. And when you look at the way sources like Ganassi and Ortiz are talking about embellishing, um, usually embellishing vocal lines, which of course is the case in this piece too. It's a chorale. Ganassi and Ortiz often give examples from madrigals. Um, but the kinds of ornaments that we find are what are often called diminutions, um, where you have uh, ornaments that are easily represented in note values. So, for example, it's hard to represent a trill like that in discrete note values, just because how many times are you moving the finger, and it depends on the speed of the piece, the tempo, and all of these sorts of things. Um, but but the ornamentation from the turn of the 17th century is often renderable in discrete note values, even if they're sometimes irregular, fives, sevens, 13s. Those are all possible, but still generally renderable notatable notatable form, and often executed with separate bow strokes. So something like this chorale in a more historical ornamentation might sound. You may have noticed that phrase ended with a trill-like figure that I played with all separate bows. That was a very common ornamentation at that time, and there are all sorts of other similar cadential ornaments. So these sorts of repetitions of a single note that has a lot of parallels in vocal ornaments of the time. So that's a bit beyond the scope of what we can get into here. But I'd encourage you, if you're not familiar with it already, to listen to music of the turn of the 17th century, Monteverdi, Caccini, particularly the vocal music, the monody, and to hear the kinds of ornaments that historically informed singers are doing, and then we can use that as a guide to our own practice of music from the period. So all of that said, what we would think of as more standard trills with the are becoming used throughout Europe and in Italy as well later into the 17th century. So by Corelli's time, they're very common. An important thing to note, though, is in Italy and in Italian styles, generally throughout the Baroque, certainly prior to the 18th century, trills from the main note, not from above. So I remember as a student playing Corelli's Folia. So the beginning is. And I remember playing it in Suzuki Book 6, probably a little less stylistic acumen at the time. And but I trilled from the main note, and I remember my teacher stopping me and saying, no, in the Baroque period, we always trill from above. And in hindsight, I since learned that that's actually not the case. I didn't know that at the time, but my only response was, in the English humor that I will blame on my father, I looked at her in all apparent earnestness and said, yes, but what if the period changed while he was writing the piece? And I wasn't always the easiest student to teach. Now, had that been the case, had someone flipped a switch and the period changed, well, in the classical era, the trills were always, the expectation was that they were from above. We'll get there momentarily. But that is to say that in 17th century Italian music, when we have these trills, they will be from the main note. And that also goes for areas that were influenced by the Italian style. So Bieber's Austria, if you're playing Bieber, main note trills. France is completely different. France always trills from above. And then that became the norm toward the middle of the 18th century. So by the time you get to Bach, Bach usually trills are from above. Some cases can be made for main note trills here and there, but in Bach it's generally appropriate to trill from above. And then in the classical era, that became the norm. By the mid 18th century, we're finding some sources that say that Quantz and others, that whenever you have a notated trill, it will be preceded by an appoggiatura and followed by a Nachschlag. And then you can see in context that doesn't always work and it's not always appropriate, but as a paradigm that was being articulated toward the middle of the 18th century. and that would become the norm for the classical era. I will also add that at this time, whenever we have appoggiaturas before a note, so a grace note, or let's just say an unnotated appoggiatura before a trill, those will always come on the beat. Sometimes I think when people are a little newer to the style, they'll sometimes play them before the beat. In the Baroque and classical styles, they're always going to come on the beat. So what I'd like to do now is zoom out and get a sense of the different flavors of ornamentation, if you will, that were prominent in Europe. To do that, we have to understand that the two stylistic superpowers were France and Italy. Now, of course, Germany was a musical superpower in its way. England had a really robust and interesting musical culture. When I say that France and Italy were the superpowers, what I mean is that they were really the trendsetters as far as styles. A nation like Germany, with all its venerable musical tradition, would have seen itself substantially as synthesizing what it found best in the French and Italian styles, and then of course adding a flavor of its own. But as far as the poles of musical style, so to speak, we're looking at France and Italy, and their ornamentation practices couldn't have been more different. So the French liked these very fine, close-knit ornaments, mordants, trills, all of these ornaments that encompass alternating adjacent notes under slurs, trills. So you'll have a lot of French textures that quite generously apply these ornaments. That's a very common French sound. By contrast, the Italians liked wild, florid ornamentation, and oftentimes composers would write movements in such a way as to seem extremely sparse, so as to leave room for this kind of ornamentation. Corelli is a great example. So this is the second sonata from his Opus 5, the opening movement. And if we just take that at face value with no ornamentation, then it does seem awfully sparse, and could be one reason that Corelli sonatas are not as often studied in the modern musical mainstream as one might hope, because they're wonderful music. But we have, well, many evidences of the kind of ornamentation practice that would have been done in the period, but one that's particularly valuable is a publication of these Opus 5 sonatas by Etienne Roget, who includes not only the violin and basso continuo lines that Corelli wrote, but then also above the violin line, an ornamented version that was supposedly played by Corelli himself. That's probably a bit of a dubious claim. How would one notate that quickly? And when you look at it, some of the ornamentation seems a little bit less worthy of a master like Corelli than we might expect. But supposedly it had Corelli's approval before publication. And it was alleged to have been played by Corelli himself. Now, whether it was or not, the fact is that that was a believable claim. People weren't saying, "Oh, this doesn't sound anything like what we would expect from Corelli." It was so we know that something along these lines is what Corelli would have been doing. And so a slow movement like this might have ended up sounding so you can see it's just a very different world than the French practice. But if I were to play this opening with characteristically French ornamentation, you can see how it would just be an entirely different aesthetic world. So it's a good idea to keep in mind what is characteristically French and what is characteristically Italian, and apply that accordingly. Now, I mentioned earlier that Germans like to synthesize things, and of course, we see that very much in the music of someone like J.S. Bach. So, you'll have things like that have, very French style ornamentation, and then you'll also have sorry, my G string has gone sharp. But the point is that that's a very Corellian type of ornamentation, and both are to be found in the music of Bach. So a good resource for studying how Bach might have ornamented, as influenced by these different styles, is actually to look at the ornamentation that he himself writes out. He marks many French type ornaments, mordants and trills and whatnot, in his music, and there is actually the Klavierbüchlein for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, the clavier book that he wrote for his eldest son. He includes an ornament table that borrows heavily from Danglebert, who was a leading late 17th century French composer for the harpsichord. So we know that Bach had direct knowledge of not only French music, of course, but also French ornamentation practice. Whereas then you can see how he might have ornamented in an Italian style by consulting that first sonata of the solo violin works. That's the opening movement of the G minor sonata, BWV 1001. The following sonata in A minor, so there's a partita in the middle, and then the next sonata also has very similar, ornamentation practice. And that one in particular, you can kind of hear this slowly walking bass, and around it and all of this highly ornamented figuration. So those are actually wonderful resources. The fact that Bach was a little bit compulsive about stipulating his ornamentation works very well for us. Anyway, I think that's about all we have time for today, but I hope that's a helpful introduction to the concept of ornamentation in Baroque music, and a bit of a primer on what belongs where, so that as we're encountering music from different nations in different decades, different times throughout the 150 years that we think of as the Baroque period, we have some idea of what our general stylistic parameters are in which to ornament. And then, of course, as I said earlier, there are a wealth of resources for further investigation, further research that you can check up on that will go into much more detail about specifics. But in any case, I hope this is a helpful introduction. So as always, happy music making.